Hey guys, so we're going to talk today about Genesis, um, and why I think Genesis, especially the first couple of chapters of Genesis, are so important, um, and how I think about them. But I want to start actually by talking about a particular romance, and it's a real life romance from the parents of a friend of mine in New Zealand. And Liz's parents' names were Bill and Issy, Bill Flitt and Issy Summers. And this was in the Depression. This was in the 1930s, 1938 or so. Bill was a Baptist preacher, young Baptist preacher. He had been going to school in Christchurch, which is the biggest city on the South Island of New Zealand. New Zealand doesn't have very many cities, but Christchurch is the biggest one in the South Island. And Issy was 26. She was living with her parents because this was the Depression. She was working in a department store. She had to leave school when she was, I think, 13 or 14 and get a job. But she was an up-and-coming poet. She had her first poem published when she was 18, and she was fairly regularly selling poems and writing short stories and so forth. So that was sort of extra income on the side to go with the department store stuff. And Bill would come when he was a student. He would preach occasionally at their church in Christchurch, and Issy thought his sermons were awesome. She thought his sermons were great. One of them she thought was so good and so inspiring that she went straight home and actually wrote a poem about the sermon, which the family still has in their papers. But that was it. She didn't have any particular romantic interest in him. And he finished his school and he went off to Dunedin, which is a 4-hour drive away at the time, maybe 5 hours in the 1930s. But everybody in the South Island goes to Christchurch occasionally. And so Issy thought Bill really liked her parents, because every time he came to Christchurch, he went to visit her parents. And now this is in the 1930s. So at the time, if a man wanted to marry a girl, he had to get her parents' permission, and he had to get her parents to like him. So Issy was just being oblivious, which her parents thought was very funny, but they didn't feel like it was her job they didn't feel like it was their job to help her figure it out. She needed to figure it out on her own. So she came home one day right before dinner time, and there were 2 letters from her, and one was from a friend. The other one, she didn't know who it was from. It was a big, thick letter, and it was handwriting that she didn't recognize at all. So she headed upstairs and she read the letter from her friend first, and then she opened the other one. And because she didn't know who it was from and she was curious, it was a 5 or 6 page letter, and she just went to the last page so she could look at the signature and see who it was from. And she got to the last page and looked at it, and it said, "So will you please consider marrying me? Sincerely, Bill Flitt." And right then, her mother said, "Issy, time for dinner." So she went down and she tried to eat, but she couldn't eat. And she tried to carry on a conversation with her parents, but she couldn't keep track of anything, unsurprisingly. And her parents asked her about her letters, and she talked about the one she'd gotten from her friend and didn't say anything about the one from Bill. And when she used to tell, Issy died in 1998, so I've never heard her tell the story. But when she used to tell it, apparently she talked about how her father basically hid behind his paper, and she could see his paper quivering, and she didn't realize till later that was because he was laughing. So as soon as she decently could, she said, "I'm not hungry. I'm going to go." And they go ahead. So she went up and she started at the beginning of this time, and she read this long letter in which he didn't just say that he loved her. He talked about the things about her that he loved and why he thought they were so admirable, and also why he thought they were so perfect for him, and the things that made him believe that she was the person he needed to spend the rest of his life with. And then finally got to the end and asked her to marry him. And so she read the whole thing, and then she read it again. And then she sat down and she wrote a letter answering, and she put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it. And she headed out to go walk down to the post office and mail it. And as she went out, she told her parents, Bill Flitt has proposed marriage to me by letter, and I'm accepting. So I want you to think about for a second. Now, first of all, surely that has to be the greatest love letter of all time, right? That to write a letter to a girl who doesn't have any particular interest in you and has no idea that you're interested in her, and propose marriage. And she gets to the end of the letter and says, I think that's a great idea. I think I'll say yes to spending the rest of my life with this man. That's got to be the greatest love letter ever. But what I want you to think about is think about what's in that letter. Think about the sorts of things that Bill Flitt must have said, and the way that he said it, and the sorts of things he was talking about and how he was talking about it. And now compare that to your science textbook, right? And look, there are some great textbooks. My statistics textbook was just, it was just a great textbook. And I realize for many of you in high school, that may seem like a very strange thing to say, that they're great textbooks. There are. This is one on states of matter. Dr. Goldstein, I can't think of his first name. But he, and don't tell me I've lost it. He, well, I may not have it. Oh, here it is, David Goldstein. David Goldstein. So this is how he begins his textbook, States of Matter, which is on the statistical mechanics, and on the chapter 1 is Introduction, Thermodynamics and Statistical Mechanics of the Perfect Gas. And so he starts off by saying, Ludwig Boltzmann, who spent much of his life studying statistical mechanics, died in 1906 by his own hand. Paul Ehrenfest, carrying on the work, died similarly in 1933. Now it is our turn to study statistical mechanics. That's not just the greatest opening to a textbook ever. That might be the greatest opening to any book ever. But I mean, that textbook, assuming you could follow the math, which is a huge assumption, a joy to read, right? But it's a textbook. And a really good textbook and a really good love letter, they're both really good, but they're really different. And Issy, the woman who got that letter and decided to marry Bill, and she did, and they were very, very happy for the rest of their lives. I think Bill died maybe 40 years later or so. And it was hugely happy and successful marriage. And Issy went on to become a novelist, and not just a novelist. When she died, and still to this day, she is the best-selling novelist in the history of New Zealand. And New Zealand includes novelists like Catherine Mansfield and Niall Marsh, Carrie Home. This is not just the best-selling one. If you take the next 6 people in line behind her and add all their books together, they didn't sell as many novels. She sold over 19 million books, and they were all romance novels. So she was writing about romance, and Bill in his love letter was writing about romance. But still, Bill's love letter and Issy's novels were very different things. And Bill's love letter and Issy's novels, and a psychology textbook talking about love, and Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is another completely different thing. So, and they all 4 are talking about love. They're all 4, the subject is love, but the purpose is different in all 4 cases. And I say all this to get you to recognize something that you probably instinctively knew, but maybe it just never, you never thought about it explicitly. In order to understand what someone's talking about, in order to understand what someone is saying to you, it's not enough to know what they're talking about. You also have to know why they're talking about it. It's not just enough to know the subject matter. You need to know the purpose. And that's true of the Bible as well. And the Bible, it's its own thing. But if you're going to ask what it's most like, the Bible is way more like Bill's love letter than anything else, because God's purpose with the Bible is really close to Bill's purpose in his love letter. Bill wrote that letter trying to convince Issy to get in a relationship with him that would last for the rest of their lives. And God wrote the Bible in order to try to convince us to get in a relationship with him that will last for all eternity. And the Bible really kind of has two fun, so you can think of that. That's one way to put it. It has one reason. Or you can think of it as that the Bible, everything in the Bible is meant to accomplish ultimately one of two things. It's either to get us to understand how to please God, or to get us to want to please him, which is a different way to say that it's there to get us to be in a relationship with him. Or you can say that this is a different way to say the same thing, but to say it a different way. It's either to get us to feel the way we should feel about God, about God and other people, or else to get us to act the way we should act towards God and other people. And that's what the Bible is about. Now, there's other stuff that you can learn from the Bible sort of along the way. Issy wrote romantic novels, and in the 20th century, people decided that romantic novels were not serious fiction. So Niall Marsh was made Dame Niall Marsh. She received a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth for writing her detective novels. But you weren't going to give a knighthood to someone who wrote romantic novels, which were just for women. But Issy set almost all but one of her novels in New Zealand, and New Zealand's a pretty spectacularly glorious place, and she wrote about real places, and she described them really well. And tens of thousands, considerably more than 100,000 people came from all over the world, including me and Helen and Kai, we did this in 2019, went to New Zealand, having decided from reading Issy's books that they just really wanted to see New Zealand. So Issy was offered membership in the Order of the British Empire, which is the knighthood thing. She was offered that, but not for writing, not for literary success. She was offered that for her contributions to New Zealand tourism. And she was like the Peter, all the people who've gone to New Zealand now because they saw the Lord of the Rings movies. She was like the Peter Jackson of the 20th century. A whole bunch of people actually moved to New Zealand and lived there the rest of their lives because they had read her novels. And that's great, and she was happy about it, but that's not why she wrote the books. And in the same way, I don't think God has any objection if we learn other useful things from the Bible, like the Acts of the Apostles. If you're doing archaeology in Turkey, even if you're an atheist, you read the Acts of the Apostles very carefully, because it is indispensably useful for you to understand archaeology, because it's outstandingly accurate history from that time, and it covers lots of different cities, and it's an immense aid to people doing archaeology in Turkey. And I'm sure God doesn't have any objection, but he did not have Luke write the Acts of the Apostles in order to help archaeologists, or rather, to help archaeologists with their archaeology. He had Luke write the Acts of the Apostles to help archaeologists, but it was to help archaeologists have a relationship with him, not to help them get their digs right. Okay, and so you always have to come at the Bible understanding that God's purpose in the Bible, it's not to entertain us, although there are parts of the Bible that are very entertaining. And it's not to help us with archaeology or history, although there are parts of the Bible that are indispensable for archaeologists and historians. And it's not as a science textbook. Anything along those lines that we happen to learn from it is great, but that's not what it's for. And if you find yourself focusing on that, if you find yourself using the Bible in order to argue physics with a physicist, or to argue history with a historian, you're probably dragging God into an argument that isn't the argument God intended to have. And that's usually not a good idea. If you're going to try to drag God into an argument, you probably need to drag him into an argument that is an argument God was willing to start, not one that you happen to be having with someone else and you want God on your side. So you just have to be a little careful about that. And it's not saying that you can't learn stuff about history or archaeology or whatever from the Bible. There's plenty of information there. You just have to be careful about trying to make God be in the arguments that you want God to be in. You need to be sure you're making the same points that God was trying to make. If you're going to say, God says, it's not just what God says, it's why God said it. And you need to make sure that when you quote God, you're quoting God for the reasons that God said what he said. Now, I haven't said anything about Genesis yet. And that was a lot of background, but I felt like it was important to understand it. So when you go back and look at the fact that God is trying to get us to feel about him the way we need to feel, so that we can have the relationship that he wants us to have. The thing about human beings is the way we feel about other people, most of the time that's determined by how we think they feel about us. If we feel like people like us, we usually like them. If we feel like people are trying to stab us in the back, we usually dislike them. And how they really feel doesn't make any difference. It's not how they really feel that affects us, it's how we think they feel about them. It's how we tell ourselves, this is why they're doing this, because they're just trying to make life miserable for me, or whatever. And so if we're going to love God, we need to understand that God loves us. And when Paul says we love him because he first loved us, most of the time, even with other people, the people that we love, most of the time, we love them because they loved us first, right? It's not just God. That's how we are as people. We respond to how we think other people feel about us. So if we don't believe God loves us, we're not going to love him. And he does love us, but the trouble is, it's a hard sale. And I'll tell you why. The sort of the fundamental things we have to understand about God up front is that he made everything. He's completely in control. Absolutely nothing happens unless God says, that's all right, I'll let it happen. Even if he doesn't straight up make it happen, he has to at least allow it to happen. And he allows absolutely horrific, terrible stuff to happen all the time. He let 6 million Jews die in the Holocaust. He let tens of millions, I don't know if it was 100 million, but he let millions upon millions upon millions of innocent Chinese people die in the Cultural Revolution. He allowed he allowed Stalin to do all the stuff Stalin did. He allows cancer. He allows 4- and 5-year-old children to die from cancer. He puts children into families that are where the parents are abusive, or even if the parents aren't abusive, that they get divorced and the kids have it's terrible stuff. Terrible stuff happens to people all the time. And so what God wants us to believe, and it's because it's true, but still, what God is asking us to believe is he's in complete control of everything that happens, and he allows all these terrible things to happen to us, and he loves us so much. I know a bunch of people who aren't Christians who think that we Christians are out of our minds because we believe that. And they just look at it and say, no sane person could possibly believe that. That is manifestly absurd. How can you possibly believe that God loves us when he lets all this stuff happen and he's supposed to be in complete control? And the Bible is about God trying to get us into a relationship with him, and he does not shy away from it. And the importance of Genesis, the first couple of chapters of Genesis in particular, is that he starts off, the very first thing he does when he opens the conversation with us is he takes that on head on. But now God runs into a different problem, and that is he's trying to explain to us, he's trying to tell us that the human story basically has sort of 3 stages. So if we start at the end, right? Now I'm trying to, from left to right, I have to remember which, so this is your left. So if we start at the end, over here, we're in heaven. It's a perfect world. Our bodies are perfect. There's no illness. There's no sadness. The evil people are out, so there's no evil. We are dealing face to face with God. We walk and talk with God, and it's perfect. And also, it is completely and utterly not imaginable for us. Absolutely no way we can imagine it. And Paul says, I think it's in Corinthians, I meant to look it up and didn't, but he says, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has ever imagined, that's what God has in mind, in store for those who love him. And that's the problem, is that God knows what's coming, but how is he supposed to tell us? And for you guys to understand this, especially the younger ones, by younger, I mean younger than 50, so teenagers, you can't explain things to people who just don't have the experience that's necessary to understand them. Even if you understand it, if you're trying to explain it to somebody who doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the experience, it's a sort of can't be done. And so what I want you guys to imagine is, imagine that you have gone to see the Houston Ballet, you've gone to the Jones Center or the downtown, the big fancy theaters downtown, and you've gone to see the Nutcracker, the Houston Ballet, Romeo and Juliet, or La Boheme, the Houston Grand Opera, or maybe you went to see Hamilton, right? Broadway musical. And the lighting and the costumes and the singing is just incredible. And you're blown away. And you come out and you think, that was just awesome. And your mother says, I'm glad you think so. I think you should share it with someone. When we get home, I want you to drag out the Braille typewriter, and I want you to write a letter to your cousin who was born deaf and blind and tell them all about Hamilton. Now, how are you going to do that? How are you going to explain the lighting effects and the costumes to someone who's never seen light, never seen color? How are you going to explain the music to someone who's never heard a sentence? Right? And the very first thing says that's impossible. I've actually had to do something like that. My wife is a painter, and she painted a really awesome painting right in the middle of Harvey, and we had friends who wanted it badly enough that they paid like $70 a piece to for us to get high quality prints so they could hang it on their walls. Just a great painting, and there was enough talk about it that one of our friends who was born blind wanted to know about that painting, and I had to try to explain what it was about that painting that made it so special. Thanks, sweetheart. And now, it didn't do me any good to say, well, it's black and white, and here's the lighting and everything else. But my friend was a professional musician. He's a magnificent pianist, world class. So I described it to him like a piece of music. I basically said, well, it's like a requiem mass. It's, you know, the themes, and I described it to him like a piece of music that would make him feel the way people who could see felt when they looked at the painting. Now, the painting's not a piece of music. And I wouldn't have explained it that way to someone who could see it. To someone who could see it, I would have just explained the painting. I would have described the painting, the black, the white, the rectangular stuff, the waves, and I would have just explained the painting. But he couldn't see. He's never been able to see. So I had to describe it like a piece of music. And if he hadn't been a musician, if he had instead been someone who was into, I don't know, role-playing games, I would have described it in terms of a role-playing game that had the same kind of feel, right? Just to try to get him to understand sort of what people felt when they looked at the painting, so he could understand why the painting was special. That's what God has to do with us when he talks about heaven, about where we're going to end up, right? And so it doesn't even help all that much for God to give the elder John a vision of heaven, because now John knows what it's like, but he has to describe it to us. And so he's in the same position as you, trying to describe Hamilton to your deaf and blind cousin. You try to describe it with something that will help them kind of get a feel for it. And that's the best you can do. And that's what God does in Revelations. The thing is, those three parts of the stories, there's heaven where there's no evil, there's no death, there's no sickness, there's no sorrow, we're face to face with God. And there's where we are right now. And then there's where we started, where there was no evil, and there was no death, and there was no sickness, and there was no sorrow, and there was no pain, and we walked face to face with God. And the Bible has no more chance of telling us what that was really like than it has of telling us what heaven was really like. It's what God fundamentally says, what the point of that story is I didn't make it this way. Yes, I created the world, but I didn't create it like this. And yes, I've allowed all this stuff to happen, but I didn't want it to be like this. This was not my plan. This was not what I wanted you to go through. This was not the story I intended for us to write together. I created a perfect world, just like we were going to. I created a world like this, a world that now you can't even begin to imagine. But I created it like this. Only I loved you enough to give you a choice. I gave Adam and Eve a choice of what kind of world they and their children would live in, and what kind of story they and their children would live out. And I told them which one they should pick. And they picked the other one. And that's how we got here. Now, I want you to, now I'm going to do one more thought experiment, and then we'll be done. Most of you, I think, have probably read science fiction about parallel universes. And if you're into Japanese light novels, isekai, right? There's 1,000 different Japanese light novels in which a Japanese person is dragged into a fantasy world. And they keep all their Japanese memories, and then I know one of them, in fact, where it's not just the parallel universe with the fantasy. There are 4 Japanese people dragged in all at once. And any of you who say, I know this, it's the Rising of the Shield Hero, congratulations on your light novel expertise. But it's 4 Japanese people, but it's from 4 different versions of Japan. It's from 4 different Japans. So there's at least 5 worlds involved there. So imagine for a sec, I'm not saying this is what really happened. I just want you to pretend for a moment that it did. Imagine that the Garden of Eden is a parallel universe that doesn't have black widow spiders and cobras and cancer and anything else. It's a perfect world, and we walk in it and we have perfect bodies. It's just like heaven, and we walk face to face with God. And when Adam and Eve messed up, God said, I'm kicking you out into a different universe, a universe I didn't even want to create. But now I have to, because I gave you the choice and this is what you chose. And you're going to live there, and I'm going to wind up coming down in there, and I'm going to send my son to live and die for you in order to ultimately get you back out into the new heaven and the new earth, back into where I wanted you to be. And so God does that, and he shows it to you, and then he says, now, I want you to explain what happened and why you guys are in this world. Only I want you to explain it to a bunch of Middle Eastern shepherds in 1500 BC, where you can't say that Adam and Eve lived in a parallel universe, because they don't know anything about universes. They've never read a science fiction novel. They've never read a novel at all. They don't know what a universe is. And they not only don't know what a parallel universe is, they don't know what parallel lines are, because geometry hasn't been invented yet. And the best thing they can imagine, they've lived all their lives in deserts, trying to find pasture. The best thing that they can imagine is a place where there's plenty of rain, plenty of water, everything's green, plants grow easily. That's the best they've got. Now, explain to them why they're living in a world that's messed up as badly as it is. If you think about it, I think you'll come to realize that by the time you're through describing it to them, you will describe something that looks a whole lot like the first couple of chapters of Genesis. And my point is not that what really happened is a parallel universe, and that God had to dumb it down for, those primitive Israelites. My point is that my thing of the parallel universe is just as dumbed down as Genesis 1 and 2. It's no more exactly what happened than Genesis 1 and 2 is, any more than, I could try to describe heaven, and whatever I said would be just as symbolic as streets of gold and gates made out of pearls, because no eye has seen, no ear has heard, the human mind has not conceived what God wants us to live in, what he created us for in the Garden of Eden, what he has waiting for us in heaven. And you're just not going to get there. And so what you fundamentally have to take away from Genesis, but you have to take this from Genesis because you can't get your relationship with God right otherwise, is God is in control and he created everything, but the world we live in now is not how he built it in Genesis 1. Paul says creation itself is groaning, waiting for us to be ready. The whole universe suffers because of Adam and Eve's sin, not just us. This is not what it's supposed to be. And it's not what God intended. It's what we chose. And that is what God says in Genesis 1 and 2. But I want you to understand something very, very clearly. Just because there's no way for God to tell us what really happened exactly the way it happened, that doesn't mean that it didn't really happen. You have to understand that Genesis 1 and 2 are not a made-up story. They're not like the parables. When Jesus tells the parable of the guy who hates his neighbor, so he sneaks out into his neighbor's field in the middle of the night and plants weeds in the middle of his neighbor's wheat. Right? When Jesus told that parable, if somebody there had said, well, what was the guy's name? Have you made sure he got arrested? Jesus would have been saying, you don't understand. It's a story. I made it up to make a point, right? That's a parable. Parables are stories that didn't really happen, but they make a point by telling the story that's me. That is not Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 is not a made-up story. Genesis 1 and 2 really happened. It's just that Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelations is really going to happen. It's just that the things that happened are things that where we are right now, we can't actually imagine it the way it was. And so God has to give us something that we can understand. But that doesn't mean they didn't happen. And so the Genesis 1 and 2 is in the literary genre of myth, but it's not a good idea to use the word myth for Genesis 1 and 2, because when you say myth, people think of, oh, it's a made-up story that didn't really happen. No, this really happened. God really created it perfect. And he really gave us a choice. And we really messed it up. And that's why we are where we are. And so that is what that's what I think we're dealing with when we're dealing with the early part of Genesis. We're dealing with stuff that really happened, but it happened in a way that the people that God was trying to get the story told to didn't have the knowledge and experience and language to be able to follow it. And so God had to explain it in a way that they would understand and be able to remember and pass down. But it really happened. It's not a made-up story. And that is my take on the early part of Genesis. And you're completely free to disagree with me entirely, but that's just my take. So there you go. And we're done.